Healthy narcissism protects us from getting depressed. It helps protects us from feeling too anxious. It's very adaptive. In fact, if you look at probably some of the most successful people in the world, they have elevated levels of healthy narcissism, but they have not crossed the boundary into narcissistic traits or narcissistic personality disorder, right? I often like to use this example. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the better than average effect in psychology, but psychologists have studied this concept of the better than average effect. If you poll the general public, most people think that they are better than others.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this next clip from my conversation with Dr. Mark Ruffalo, we move from our earlier discussion about how narcissism gets defined and often misunderstood into a deeper exploration of what actually holds narcissistic experiences together from inside. We begin with the idea of the grandiose fantasy, something Mark wrote about in his article. We discuss how it becomes something structurally important in understanding narcissistic personality organization. From there, we explore many aspects of the fantasy, such as what is it actually doing for the person emotionally, and what it helps regulate or keep out of awareness. And we do this by way of a clinical example or two. We explore so much more, such as what does it really take to work effectively with these dynamics? And Mark gives us a nice theoretical position, two different theoretical positions, a Kohutian versus a Kernberg approach. And don't worry, if that's not clear, it will become clear as you listen to the interview. So without further ado, I want to get you right into the conversation so you can hear more about what actually leads to effective treatment or healing once you recognize these kind of narcissistic personality traits. In the article, you wrote that the grandiose fantasy is central to understanding narcissism, and I put emphasis on the word central, and at times even necessary for diagnosis. So clearly you think this is very important. And again, just like I started at the very beginning of our interview, I want to just give a quick quote, okay, something from the article, that you say such fantasies are so central to pathological narcissism that NPD should not be diagnosed in the absence of them. So what I wanted to talk to you about is, what is this grandiose fantasy? Like, in other words, if we even go back to like the prototypical example that you gave us a little bit earlier, and what's the fantasy? Like, what does that even mean? Because I know this isn't just like an ordinary daydream. It has to be different, right?
Yes.
And what's it actually doing for the person internally in terms of structurally? How does it hold them together?
Yeah. So a grandiose fantasy, it differs from what we might call just positive thinking or being optimistic about the future. I think that's fundamentally important. Grandiose fantasies in narcissistic personality disorder, and there was a wonderful paper by a couple of researchers, I believe at Harvard, named Finch and Hooley, back from 2023. I referenced the paper in my Psychiatric Times piece. They delineate what is meant by grandiose fantasy. So grandiose fantasies, common in narcissistic personality patients, right? They tend to be much more unrealistic than just positive thinking or optimistic thinking about the future. So there's an unrealistic quality to them. They tend to occur, farther in the future. They often, in, more covert narcissistic presentations, have a flavor of attaining some retribution or retaliation against a figure or a person or perhaps a group that's harmed them in the past. And so let's just give a clinical example that might help elucidate things, right? Mm-hmm. A patient comes in and says that they've just gotten a new job at a law firm, and he or she says, I really enjoy working at the firm, and I think that I'd like to spend my career here. And in fact, maybe in time, in 20 years or so, maybe I'll be able to become one of the leaders of this firm. Nothing pathological about that. That person is optimistic about his or her abilities and perhaps as an attorney, right? The narcissistic patient comes in, right, and says, I just started this new job at this big law firm, and it's really great to have the association with this firm. They're the best firm in town. But my boss is a real jerk. I don't get along with him. I think he's got big problems, and I know a lot of about him and from my work with my other employer, you know what? Within 6 months, he's going to be out of there. I'm going to have his job. And you know what? Before I know it, I'm going to be running this firm, right? And then I'll leave and then I'll start a firm of my own that's going to be even bigger and better than this. It's sort of an exaggeration, but actually some narcissistic patients might get there. They might give off that flavor, right? And so it's much more unrealistic. It has this envious quality, the envy.
Yes, that's the envy again. Yeah.
Tied in there, occurs farther in the future. Let's think of one together, Dr. Mazzella.
Let's use this one just to flush it out a little bit because it was so rich. I think we could pull it apart because I heard a couple of things. One is you did already mention the envy because you can hear the envy in there that he can't tolerate the position that he's walked in. So he can't tolerate the position that he's in. So he's already imagining being in a different position.
That's right.
Which, by the way, anybody who is struggling with these characteristics or this grandiosity, what we're calling the grandiosity, I want to highlight that you could see already how this is adaptive. You see, it's adaptive in the sense that you cannot tolerate being in, let's just call it a one down position, which is not an infrequent feeling that these people have. It's always who's up and who's down, right? So there it becomes the grandiose fantasy, which I call the structure that holds them together. You could see already how it's working. This would make him feel better, right? But to your point, Mark, you said far in the future. The way that I would describe that is they tend to get further removed from reality. And I think that goes back to being very careful with differentiating between pathological and what you call like more healthy narcissism a little bit earlier.
Yes.
Whereas we need to start thinking about reality testing. And this is further removed from the reality of the situation. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I haven't thought necessarily in terms of reality testing, but yes, it makes perfect sense. In this vignette, there's envy. We could imagine perhaps that this person, this imagined patient, really struggles with feeling inferior and inadequate. An entry-level position at a law firm is not what he has in mind for himself in this world, right? And as a result of that, resorts to these characteristic defenses, these narcissistic defenses, to feel good enough about himself, to sustain himself in the face of injury and insult.
Yeah, and this is such an important point to dwell on because one of the things I wanted to ask you, and I think we're answering it right now, is if you didn't have these grandiose fantasies, what I call the grandiose structure, what would begin to emerge? And I think you're saying it right now, which are what? More painful, difficult feelings that are intolerable.
That's right. Much more painful affects, if you will, right? So the patient may experience profound depression. Often, narcissistic personality, by the way, is misdiagnosed as depression. These patients come in often when they are depressed, when they're feeling depressed. I don't think that always means that they have a second illness called major depression. I think depressions within the context of narcissistic personality are common, occur with some frequency, and often in the face of injury or insult, narcissistic.
Oh, wait, let me dwell on that. I'm curious to pick your brain about this one. Would you still call it depression? Like, is it like then a mood disorder? Or is it what we call narcissistic deflation? Like, how do you distinguish between the two? Because early on, again, when I first started the podcast, I did a series of episodes on depression versus narcissistic deflation and trying to separate out the two.
Yeah. This is not a mood disorder. This is a symptom of the narcissistic syndrome. Very often, what ends up happening is the patient, if the personality disorder is recognized at all, it gets diagnosed with a second condition. And that speaks to problems with our DSM system. Some of my more recent writing has been on DSM and nosology and classification, right? DSM basically says diagnose as many conditions as the patient meets criteria for, without necessarily pointing to an index condition or a primary disorder, right? So in this example, let's say narcissistic personality is the primary condition from which this patient suffers. The depressions or secondary depressions would be the right? They don't respond to medication the way melancholic depression responds to depression. Right?
Wait, stop. Yes. I have to dwell on that. That is so important. Again, I don't want to go over this too quickly because so many of the referrals, patients that I get coming to me have been in treatment for years and years for oftentimes depression or some mood-related disorder. And I wanted to dwell on this, Mark, because again, we're talking about your article, right? And one of the things that you're pushing for is diagnostic clarity. So what you're pointing out right now is diagnostic, ambiguity or misdiagnosis, right? So someone is getting treated, but the personality disorder goes unnoticed. And I often say this, if you're taking medication, and this isn't, I don't mean it in such an absolute way, and you've been doing this for years and you're not responding, have you ever thought that maybe this is not depression, that there may be something else going on?
That's
right?
absolutely right.
Yeah.
The unfortunate problem is that many of these patients today go on to be diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression. Well, a percentage of patients who are diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression probably don't have a mood disorder at all. They probably have a
Yes.
personality disorder or
Yeah.
bipolar disorder or something else. And so you're right, diagnostic clarity. And unfortunately, our friends in the psychoanalytic world historically have not paid enough attention to diagnosis, in my view.
Mm.
This comes from the biological psychiatry folks, the people who were influential with the development of DSM-3, the need for scientific validity of our diagnoses. Do our diagnoses actually point to real issues or conditions in the world? And we need to be very careful with our language, right? But the older psychoanalysts didn't care a whole lot about diagnosis. You were either neurotic, psychotic, or you were somewhere in between, and then you were borderline, right?
Yes.
Yes, you can't treat narcissistic depression or what you've called narcissistic deflation with medicine. It just doesn't work. Unfortunately, because a lot of people are not trained in personality pathology or personality diagnosis, particularly our friends in psychiatry, and I teach psychiatry residents and I love psychiatry professionals, a lot of them just are not all that well versed or well spoken in personality functioning. And a lot of personality disorder is misdiagnosed as either mood disorder or
Yeah.
some other, it used to be Axis 1 condition. I see this all the time with my work with borderline personality patients for which there is no effective medication for borderline disorder. You might be able to touch some of the symptoms with medicine. No one actually believes that medication touches the core psychopathology of borderline personality. And I believe the same is true for narcissistic personality.
Let's pivot then and get into that. This is a nice way to pull everything together because we're talking about treatment. And I wanted to ask you this question as well. But again, we're sort of rolling into it naturally. So once you begin to recognize, right, this is where we started at the beginning of this episode. They walk in the room and I was asking you, how do you know? Like, how do you know when someone has these characteristics versus a differential diagnosis? But let's say it's the grandiose sense of self. That's the question we started with, the structure that holds them together. Once you recognize that, right, Mark, in a clinical setting, or for anybody who's listening, even in your personal relationships or within yourself, how do you actually work with it? Like if you notice this is not a mood disorder, right? Or this is not, we didn't get into borderline, by the way. We'll have to save that for another interview. But how do you actually work with it then?
It's an important question because, diagnosis is one thing. Treatment is something different.
Yeah.
How do we actually work? I've already said medicine won't help the patient.
Yes.
For the most part. Really, the answer to your question, Dr. Mazzella, as you probably know, is that your method of treatment or working with patients in psychotherapy really depends largely on your theoretical persuasion, even within the psychoanalytic world, right? And so for the listeners, major disagreements between Heinz Kohut and the self-psychology folks, many of them in Chicago, and people who were followers or are followers of Otto Kernberg. And I've spent a year training with Dr. Kernberg in a personality disorders program, and I had some earlier training with some of the self-psychology people. So, this is sometimes referred to as the difference between deficit models and conflict models, right? So, basically, Kernberg would emphasize the need for interpretation of the patient's defenses, splitting, projection, projective identification, omnipotent control, etc., right? Devaluation, primitive idealization, which is more common in borderline patients, but you do see it in narcissistic patients too. So interpretation of the defenses, a focus on the transference, what happens between the patient and the therapist, what is projected onto the therapist, how the patient's relational difficulties manifest in the treatment relationship. So Kernberg being influenced by the object relations school as well as ego psychology, right? And so there's a focus on interpretation of defenses and the transference. Kohut, by contrast, was writing from a different perspective and saw the narcissistic patient as having a fundamental deficit in self-esteem. And the differences between the two approaches may be somewhat attributable to the fact that these doctors saw a different subset of patients. Kohut was in private practice in Chicago, probably seeing a generally healthier group of patients, probably, sort of functional narcissistic businessmen. Kernberg trained in hospitals and saw severely personality disordered patients. So their theoretical models diverge partly on that basis, I think, right? So Kernberg would focus on interpretation. Kohut would focus on what he called self-object function. So how the narcissistic patient relies on others to perform a vital psychological function that he can't perform himself, which is basically the regulation of self-esteem. So Kohut thought that there was a fundamental deficit in self-esteem, and then pointing out how this manifests in the treatment relationship, how when the therapist says something that may sort of rub the narcissistic patient the wrong way, that's talked about, and how the patient has come to rely on the admiration of others form this vital function, which really deviates quite distinctly from Kernberg's model. And so that's a basic, very broad and simplified summary of how treatment approaches can differ. But yes, and of course there are other ways of working with patients from other schools of thought as well.
Let me think about what you said. And I'm thinking about the audience who's listening to this, again, who might be recognizing these traits in themselves or in others, a loved one, for instance. And I'm imagining, based on those two conceptual positions that you gave, theoretical perspectives, how might they begin to live with this, work with it, think about it? So if you are more of the Kernbergian type, this is something that you may begin to confront more actively. Again, either within yourself or within a loved one. So in other words, if a loved one is dismissive of you, condescending, disregards you, that's something that you may begin to bring into the room, that their need to do it this way. Actually, I gave this as an example some months ago in another episode where a guy was changing the light bulb and he broke it. And his wife is like, "What's the matter with you? You're so clumsy. You broke the light bulb. You're always rushing. You're so preoccupied. You're in another world." And I was imagining this fellow talking to the wife about, "Okay, I understand I broke the light bulb. Yeah. But why the need to take it this far? Like, how does this turn me into a narcissist?" Because inevitably she starts labeling and calling him names. Yep. So it's like, there's a confrontation. So now you're calling out something, again, to bring this full circle, that wife might be splitting off and projecting into you. Maybe she had some feelings about the fact that she couldn't change the light bulb herself and was depending on you. Who knows, right?
Yeah. Who knows is right. And so, an example that I like to give when I talk about Kernberg versus Kohut, to get a little sooty here, right, is Kernberg might say something along the lines of, "It seems that you need to speak poorly of me because you envy my ability to help and you envy other people." So an interpretation or confrontation of the patient's patterns as they play out in the transference. Kohut might say something like, and I'm oversimplifying here, of course, for the purposes of a podcast interview, but might say something along the lines of, "It must feel really painful when other people don't value your achievements or your skill or your abilities." So empathizing, right? Kohut was big on empathy, the ability to feel what it must be like to be in the patient's shoes, right? It must be really painful for you. It must be very difficult for you to feel that way, feel what you feel when other people don't recognize your talents or something like that. Mm-hmm. So pointing out the self-object relationship or self-object function.
Yeah. And it's more, what John Steiner calls, that's more of what he calls a patient-centered interpretation. Yes. Like you're making it about the other person.
Yes.
But that's not always it's not always accepted. Sometimes that leads to a very high level of more defensiveness. Again, we're pulling things together, and we spoke about defenses earlier on. Yes. So then it's safer sometimes to give what he calls an analyst-centered interpretation, right? Like you pull it onto yourself, right? Yeah. But this is a whole nother discussion that we have to save for another time, Mark, because again, I have to let you run. I just want to express how much I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and really sit and think about some of these questions that I was raising about what I think you wrote was a very insightful article that got me thinking, at least. And again, to all the listeners, I'll put the link to that article in the show notes. But I really appreciate, Mark, your thoughtful way of approaching the importance of not just labeling, right? Not just that we need to be a little bit more precise when we're thinking about diagnosis and be careful with that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's the take-home message. It's not that narcissism is not real or sort of negating the real interpersonal impact of pathological degrees of narcissism, but rather to be careful with our language. If our terms have meaning, we ought to use them precisely. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come on the show here with you, Dr. Mazzella. It's been great. Mm-hmm. I'd love to come back and talk about borderline or something else.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. I just recently wrapped up and released like a 4-part series, I think, on differentiating borderline versus narcissism. And just for the audience, Mark did share an article that he has coming out. It's not yet in press, but I read that, and I've, of course, had a lot of questions, just like I did today. So we'll have to do that next time, okay?
Let's do it again. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you again. All right. Take care. There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.